Last 24 hours were a time period when, as far as I can see, the media presentation of events on the Ukrainian battlefields was, shall we say, inconsistent, very inconsistent with actual events. Let's first of all discuss these events and see how we can understand them, and then maybe I'll just say a few things before I touch on other matters. Firstly, what did happen yesterday? Well, the first piece of news, the most important piece of news, as far as I can see, is that there was a very big advance by the Wagner forces in Bakhmut. Now, this was the fastest advance the Wagner forces have achieved in Bakhmut for, several weeks now. If you believe Prigozhin and the Wagner organization people, which I do, I've always said that when it comes to factual information about battlefield advances and indeed retreats, they tend to be very accurate. Well, if you believe Prigozhin and the Wagner forces, then the Wagner forces yesterday advanced by about 400 meters within Bakhmut. The total area of Bakhmut under Ukrainian control has now declined to an area of supposedly 1.96 square kilometers. That's according to the Wagner forces. But as I've said on many occasions, this is somewhat misleading. Depends, of course, where you draw the line and set out the metropolitan area of Bakhmut. It's actually smaller than that, at least in my opinion, and Prigozhin himself effectively confirmed this. He said that there's only 20 buildings in Bakhmut which remain to be taken, Ukrainian-controlled buildings. Now, a building can cover many things. It can be a small garden shed, or it can be a big apartment building. And of course, what Prigozhin is talking about is large buildings. I mean, he's not concerned with garden sheds or wooden dachas or those sort of things, which can be cleared, I presume, fairly quickly. He's talking about large structures that the Ukrainians can defend and which they fortified up to a certain point, at least. And he particularly focuses, as many Russian commentators do, on an area in Bakhmut that now goes by the name of the Nest. It's a sort of complex of large buildings. I'm not entirely sure what their purpose was, which have been turned into a sort of fortified position by the Ukrainian forces, and which seems to be, as far as I can tell, the one remaining anchor of the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut. Now, over the last couple of days, the Wagner forces have actually penetrated into this complex of buildings, and it seems they've already captured some of them. I presume when Prigozhin says that there's 20 buildings still to take, he's probably referring to 20 buildings within this particular complex. But I'm not sure, because of course I'm not on the site. I don't have direct contact with people on location. This is a deduction, but I think it is a reasonable deduction. There is fighting going on in other places, and perhaps the most important of these places is in the northwestern outskirts of Bakhmut. There does seem to be some information that Wagner forces are also advancing on an important crossroads. If they capture this crossroads, then the road from Khromovo loses its utility to the Ukrainians, because it is at this crossroads that whatever supplies Ukraine is still able to send over this road it's through this crossroads that they would have to pass. And the Wagner forces do seem to be very close to this crossroads. But again, I can't say how close exactly. My map reading skills or satellite picture reading skills don't extend that far. And I don't know what sort of structures lie between the Wagner forces and the crossroads, and how many Ukrainian troops are there, and by the way, how many Wagner troops are there either. But there is clearly fighting going on in that location too, and the Wagner forces have been advancing. So a couple of days ago, a Wagner soldier told Novosti News that the 742 meters of ground still to cover, in other words, to advance, the line of the advance is about 742 meters. If you believe Prigozhin, which I tend to do, a lot of that ground has now been covered. So we now have a situation where the territory in Bakhmut under Ukrainian control is dwindling fast. As I said, a particularly big loss of contested territory inside Bakhmut was lost yesterday, and where all the appearances suggest the situation has become extremely difficult for Ukraine. But of course, that's not what most people were talking about yesterday, neither in the Western media, nor, by the way, in the Russian media as well, or in the various commentaries or other channels. The big advance by the Wagner forces inside Bakhmut was largely ignored because of massive amount of discussion about what is going on the flanks, on the northern flank and on the southern flank. And I'm going to say what I briefly think there. A lot of media coverage in the West is talking about the Ukrainians launching a counteroffensive in Bakhmut. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. They haven't confirmed it. They seem to be pouring cold water on that idea. They don't seem to be talking about a major counteroffensive at the moment, though it's clear that they have been putting some pressure on Russian forces in the flanks. And this has been an operation that has been underway in fits and starts since Tuesday. And if one puts aside some of the commentary that we've been hearing, lots and lots of commentary about Russian retreats, Ukrainian advances, that sort of thing. It seems to me that what all of this has amounted to so far is Ukrainian troops nibbling away at some Russian positions and capturing a couple of 100 meters of territory here, couple of 100 meters of territory there, all of this territory being essentially open fields. And Russian losses do not appear to have been especially high. And when the Russians say that they pulled back to more defendable defense lines, that seems to me to be the case. And the situation hasn't changed radically overall. The Ukrainians have succeeded in pushing the Russian forces off the Khromovo road. And there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that this was supposedly a major success. However, I suspect that that road continues to be essentially unusable to heavy traffic because, well, as far as I can tell, it's still within range of Russian artillery, and I would have thought that with Russian drones operating over the road, any large formations of Ukrainian troops that try to move into Bakhmut along this road would be targeted by the Russians in exactly the same way as they have been for many, many weeks now. And in fact, if one sees film of this road, one sees that the road is littered with pictures of burnt out vehicles, as the Ukrainians have indeed tried to push their forces to use this road to send in supplies into Bakhmut. And that's essentially it. I can't see that there is very much more I can add to that. Now, I am conscious that there will be some people who will say that this is a complacent view, at least complacent from a Russian perspective. I would say that I've been following this battle fairly closely now for many weeks. I also have to immediately again add the important qualification that I'm not any person with any degree of military experience whatsoever. Everything I've learnt about war, I've learnt basically from observing this battle. But what I can say is that throughout this battle, certainly since the battle in Bakhmut and its environs began in earnest around January time, there's been a lot of ebb and flow. The Russians have advanced, the Ukrainians have hit back, the Russians have pulled back, sometimes the Russians have gone back on the attack and retrieved territory. This has been going on along the sort of flanks. For example, there was a lot of speculation at one time that the Russians were going to capture a village called Ivanivska, Krasnoye, as they sometimes call it, in the south of Bakhmut. It was a village that lies on top of one of the spurs of the road that leads into Bakhmut. The Russians sometimes reached the outskirts of Ivanivska. There was even one report, I remember, that they'd actually broken into Ivanivska. The Ukrainians then launched a counterattack. They pushed the Russians out of Ivanivska several hundreds of meters away from Ivanivska. From my best recollection, this happened sometime around February. And, of course, there's been ebb and flow, pushbacks, advances, all that sort of thing. And it goes on all the time. And up to this point, I have to say, I haven't seen anything that is radically different from that. Now, that, of course, relates to the fighting on the Khromovo Road, where it's been like that too. There's been, as I said, Russian advances a couple of days ago, about a week ago, maybe a bit longer. We got news, confirmation in fact, that the Wagner forces had advanced close to a place called Bogdanovka, which is a village which remains under Ukrainian control. Again, there's been lots of speculation that the Russians intended to storm Bogdanovka. They've never, as far as I can see, made a real effort to do so. Anyway, the Russians did manage to cut the road, to actually advance on the road themselves west of Bogdanovka, quite far, in other words, from Bakhmut. It's unsurprising that the Ukrainians would be intent on pushing the Russians off the road again, and it seems to me that that's what's happened. And given that this is an area somewhat distant from the main Russian positions, it was perhaps unsurprising, given the effort the Ukrainians put in to pushing the Russians back, that they have been successful. So I just want to say this. Now, it may be that this will evolve into something bigger, that the Ukrainians are going to try something more ambitious around Bakhmut. There's been all kinds of claims that they're going to try to push very hard on the flanks, that they're going to try and encircle Bakhmut. I'm not sure how they can do that, actually. Again, I'm not a military tactician or expert, but it does seem to me that the Russians are located not just to the north and south of Bakhmut, but to the east of Bakhmut as well. There's a clear road into Bakhmut from Popasnaya, which is firmly under Russian control. I mean, I think it would require a very, very big offensive by Ukraine indeed to encircle Bakhmut entirely and trap the Russian forces there. It would require not just thousands, but probably tens of thousands of men to achieve it. And it would also require a total collapse by the Russian military in the area. Now, I'm not saying that such things are impossible. Maybe that is the Ukrainian plan. Maybe the Ukrainian plan is to launch such a big offensive. All I am saying is that up to this moment in time, and I'm making this video when I can make it, I don't see that is the situation that is developing. However, it is possible, as I said, that the Ukrainians do have something more ambitious in mind, and that brings me to the events which took place on Thursday. And these are perhaps the most important events because this was the major attack that the Ukrainians launched. Now on Tuesday, first Ukrainian attack was actually in an open field, some distance south of Ivanivska, not particularly close to the fighting, at least not directly connected to the fighting. It was an open field in front of a canal and forested area, and a small group of fighters of the reconstituted Azov regiment with some armor attacked a Russian unit that was occupying this particular field. Now, this is the unit that Prigozhin said was the 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian army. Now, many people have tried to establish the identity of this unit. Prigozhin made it, I think, fairly clear that he conceived of it as a unit of the Russian regular army, but nobody has been able to locate a 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade that belongs to the Russian army. Some have suggested that, in fact, it is a militia unit that belongs to the so-called Third Corps of the Donbass militia, a formation that was set up in August, and I sort of went along with that for a while. I'm now having some doubts about this as well. There was a very interesting and useful live stream on Slavyangrad yesterday, and one of the commentators there said that the unit that was caught in this field was actually company strength, about company strength. So we're talking about not a brigade, which should be, well, several thousand men, but perhaps 100, perhaps a few more. Perhaps this unit has been misidentified. Who's to say? But anyway, I doubt that it was under orders to defend this field, which is a small place, relatively speaking, far, as I said, from the main fighting. I doubt that it was ordered to defend this field in the face of a sustained attack by an armoured unit, and unsurprisingly, they withdrew into the much more defensible area behind the canal into the forest. And again, I suspect that that is all that happened. So far, there's been no word of any more Ukrainian advances in that particular area. There were, however, these Ukrainian advances on Thursday, and this is perhaps where the intrigue really comes into play, because there was obviously fighting on the Khromovo road, which I've talked about. There was also some kind of Ukrainian probing attack against a place called Mayorsk. I'm not entirely sure where Mayorsk is, but I get the sense it was further north. That seems to have been unsuccessful. But the main Ukrainian advance, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, was by a force of something like 1,000 men, apparently, towards Soledar, which is this town located to the northeast of Bakhmut, which was captured by the Wagner forces in January. Now, at least this is how I understand it. And this appears to have been the major Ukrainian attack on Thursday, again, if you believe the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the Ministry of Defense says that this attack was repelled and that out of the 1,000 men who were involved in this attack, the Ukrainians suffered losses of 540. Now, that's an important qualification. It doesn't mean that all of these people were killed. I suspect the great majority of them were wounded. But anyway, the Ukrainian attack suffered losses, and a significant number of the armoured vehicles that participated in this attack were destroyed, including 8 tanks. Now, I have been somewhat unsure about this attack, about whether this attack has actually ever did take place. I say that because I'm sorry to say this, but there have been instances when the Russian Ministry of Defense has provided knowingly false information. In other words, they've lied. And they did that during the Kharkiv offensive, as I only too well remember, when they claimed that a relief force was hurtling to secure the positions in Kupiansk and ETHEREUM, and they provided pictures of this relief force moving rapidly down a motorway, except the whole thing was a prop. It was simply a case of Russian troops moving up and down the Moscow Ring Road as part of a deception operation to deceive the Ukrainians, to make the Ukrainians think that a Russian force was coming to the rescue of the Russian troops in Kupiansk and ETHEREUM and elsewhere. By that point, in fact, the Russians had already decided to withdraw from these places. Well, that was one outright deception. And I have to say there was a much less excusable deception, lie, in other words, a couple of weeks ago, when following a HIMARS strike on a building in, I think, Lugansk region, where perhaps 120, 130 Russian reservists were killed. Short time later, the Russians claimed that the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that a Russian counterstrike had struck a building, a Ukrainian building, and had killed, from memory, I think it was 500 Ukrainian troops that were housed in that building. Well, for various reasons, I've come to the clear view that this Russian counterstrike never happened, and that whole episode was simply invented. And it did strike me as at least possible, and I'm sorry to say this, but it does happen, that the Russians were again lying about this big Ukrainian attack on Thursday. After all, there'd been this litany of complaints for weeks now from Prigozhin about ammunition shortages, problems in the flanks, and that kind of thing. And it did seem to me that the Defense Ministry might have felt that they were under some kind of pressure, and that they wanted to give themselves some cover for the fact that they'd withdrawn their forces from one or two places, as they're giving up essentially dead ground, and that they invented this big Ukrainian attack and this victory over this Ukrainian attack, and that nothing like that really happened. Well, I'm now starting to come round to the view that there probably was a Ukrainian attack, and it probably was on a large scale on Thursday night, and they did try to push towards Soledar. I'm not sure of the exact scale of that attack, but there's now been reports from various Russian reporters and military journalists and soldiers and people like that who appear to be providing some corroboration for the Russian Ministry of Defence's story. Now, there are some problems with some of this corroboration, as far as I'm concerned. One particular soldier, for example, Russian soldier, who claims that he was involved in the fighting which caused this particular attack to be repelled. Anyway, he's now claiming, or he's reported to be claiming, that over the course of this attack, a Leopard 2 tank, a German Leopard 2 tank, was destroyed by a mine, and that the Ukrainians tried to retrieve it, but that they were driven off by the Russians. I've seen no photographic evidence to confirm this story. I very, very much doubt that the Ukrainian military would have used its small stock of Leopard 2 tanks in this sort of way. If they did, by the way, that would be very interesting. But anyway, I'm skeptical of that story, and there have been cases in the past when Russian troops have made claims about the existence of Leopard 2s on the battlefield and about the destruction of Leopard 2s. And I'm going to say straightforwardly that I don't believe a single one. And for the moment, I don't believe this story either. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that it does seem as if there was some sort of Ukrainian attack towards Soledar, and that this did indeed involve a significant number of men and machines, and that it was indeed repelled. Now, what does this mean? Now, it could be that this attack was intended to force the Russians to redeploy forces away from the Khromovo Road, in which case, even though the attack was repelled, one could say it achieved a certain success, though at a very high cost indeed in men and machines. And there's said to be information circulating in Ukrainian Telegram channels, information I haven't seen, by the way, that supposedly says that there's been criticisms of General Syrski, that he launched this attack, that many good soldiers and equipment were lost to little real purpose and effect, which is possible. I mean, as I said, I haven't myself seen these reports. There's only a limited amount of reports I can read in any 24-hour period. But anyway, it's possible, as I said, that it was entirely and exclusively intended to enable this clearance of the Khromovo Road. But alternative view is that this was a serious attack, a genuine attack, to try to push towards Soledar. In other words, to carry out some kind of major flanking maneuver around the Russian forces in Bakhmut, and that this time it failed, but it could be an indicator that the Ukrainians, once they've sorted themselves out again and reinforced, are going to try another attack in this area again. Now, if that is what the Ukrainians do intend to do, then I think we are justified about talking about some kind of Ukrainian counterattack, serious counterattack in this area. But I want to stress again, for the moment, I don't really see that the evidence, the movements, the changes of position on the ground, on the flanks, has had the big implications that some people say. Now, over the next couple of days, as we get more information, as we get more sense of what the Ukrainians intend to do, perhaps we will get more information that will suggest that this is a more serious attack than it appears to be at the moment. But overall, that is the picture that I have seen. Now, just to say, there were further Ukrainian advances along the flanks yesterday, Friday. They seem to have been on a significantly smaller scale than on Thursday. They all seem to have been in this northern spur, the pincer, the Russian pincer, which, as I said, stopped advancing some weeks ago as the Russian focus, switched to clearing Bakhmut itself. Again, the amount of territory that the Ukrainians captured yesterday seems to have been relatively small, and it seems again to have been largely fields. I don't think this had any particular military significance at all, and I don't think it changes the overall situation in any way, and it is less than what the Ukrainians captured on the previous day, on Thursday. So take all of this as you will. It may be that some big Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut is in preparation. The Ukrainians themselves have suggested otherwise. But the big story yesterday in Bakhmut, I want to reiterate again, was not these small moves on the flanks. It was the big advance by the Wagner forces against fiercely contested territory in the west of Bakhmut, 400 meters, according to Prigozhin and his Wagner people, with only 20 big buildings left to take, and the Ukrainians now holding even less than 2 square kilometers of territory, and perhaps in practical terms, even less than that. I would add that if the Russians do capture this crossroads I was talking about, then the access of the Ukrainian troops, the garrison, the remaining garrison in Bakhmut to the Khromovo road will have presumably been irretrievably lost, in which case all of this fighting that we've seen on the Khromovo road over the last few days will have become irrelevant, and it could be that one of the reasons why the Russians were not motivated to fight determinedly to cling on to their positions on the Khromovo road is because they sense that the fight in Bakhmut is coming to an end, and that with the capture of this crossroads, if it does indeed happen over the next few days, the fighting over this road is going to become irrelevant anyway. Now, that's all I get to say about the situation in Bakhmut. As I said, this is purely my own reading of the position up to now. In a sense, and I think this is fair to say, it is for the Ukrainians now to show what they intend to do in this area. The Russians, it seems to me, their objectives now are absolutely clear. It is to clear Bakhmut. It is to capture Bakhmut itself. They're pushing hard on the remaining few Ukrainian positions inside Bakhmut. These Ukrainian attacks along the flanks, they might have had any number of causes. They might, as some are suggesting, have been intended to make it easier for the remaining Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut to withdraw. That's one possibility. Another is that they might be trying to reinforce the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, or it could be that they are preparations for something bigger. So, as I said, it's for the Ukrainians, in a sense, to show what it is that they are preparing to do. But if this is the beginning of some bigger offensive in Bakhmut or in the area of Bakhmut by Ukraine, then I don't think we've seen clear-cut proof of it for the moment. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation in Bakhmut. We'll see what happens over the next 24 hours. We'll see whether the Ukrainians are able to develop these advances that they've made, whether they are going to increase the pressure on the flanks, whether they're going to pull out instead, what the Wagner forces continue to do inside Bakhmut itself. So I will obviously keep you all informed of my of the information, with the important qualification again that I am reliant entirely on secondary open sources about what is going on there, and that of course I'm not either a military tactician or somebody who is informed about the internal plans that the Ukrainians and the Russians have. Anyway, what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts? Well, yesterday, and by the way today as well, have been hours of massive Russian missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, and also from the other side, the first use of the Storm Shadow system by the Ukrainians in attacks on Russian positions in Lugansk region. Now, there were 2 missile strikes on Lugansk city yesterday. Initially, these were reported to have been carried out by the Ukrainian Grom 2 system, which is a ballistic missile, which the Russians have shown no difficulty shooting down. There was another strike, or 2 strikes, over the last few hours, and those strikes have been confirmed as having been carried out by British-French, Anglo-French Storm Shadow missiles, and I suspect that the previous strikes were by the Storm Shadow system as well. So far, according to the Russians, these missiles have not done any significant damage. One of them hit a factory complex, which has been out of operation for some time, and it seems that there haven't been many or any casualties reported so far. I have seen a satellite picture of the area of one of these missile strikes, and it does appear to show Russian military facilities and bases not far from there, and I presume that that was what these missiles were intended to hit, but it seems on this occasion that they didn't succeed. Now, why they didn't succeed, I have no idea. And the most interesting and significant twist to this particular attack on Lugansk is not that these missiles were used, but something else, which is that the strike happened alongside the use by Ukraine of an American decoy missile. Now, that is, to my mind, very interesting because it confirms a suspicion that Alex Christoforou and I discussed on a video that we did on the Duran, discussing the supply of Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. We said that we speculated that though it is the British who are supplying these missiles, they have almost certainly been put up to do it by the US authorities, or at least by some of the authorities in the US. The US has categorically refused to supply Ukraine with supersonic ATACMS missiles, ground-launched ATACMS missiles. And they've apparently directed the Ukrainians towards the British and have suggested that since the Ukrainians are not going to get ATACMS missiles, they should seek comparably ranged Storm Shadow missiles from the British instead. And the fact that these missiles are being used with American decoy missiles in company gives a very strong clue that, as I said, this whole operation has indeed been carried out with the cooperation, with the involvement of the US authorities. So this is a serious escalation. Now, I've had a huge amount of commentary discussion about the Storm Shadow missiles, how effective they are. I want to say once again that if you're talking about what the Russians think about these Storm Shadow missiles, well, I don't know. They don't, as I said, share their secrets with me, but their open sources suggest that they take the threat from the Storm Shadow missiles very seriously. At the same time, I also get the sense that they believe that in time they will be able to counter them. That at the moment, they're still trying to work out how these missiles work. They haven't yet developed the counters to them. But as happened with the HIMARS rockets that the United States supplied to Ukraine in the summer, for a brief period in the summer and early autumn, the HIMARS were being used with some success, though I should say I'm now getting quite a lot of information which suggests that even their success then was being overstated. But anyway, they were being used with some success. Today, the HIMARS has greatly, significantly lost effectiveness. The Russians are not only able to intercept the HIMARS rockets successfully, they've shown that they can jam them too. And Ukraine is not able to use HIMARS with anything like the success that they were able to do it in the summer. And it could be that we're going to see the same cycle with the Storm Shadow. It'll have some impact in the first weeks of its operation, and then as the Russian air defense system comes to understand it better, we'll start to see counters, and it will start to be less effective than it was. I, by the way, maintain my view based on the preponderance of information that I have received, that despite strenuous claims on the part of some people, the ATACMS is a much more effective and much more dangerous missile from a Russian point of view, and much more difficult for the Russians to keep track of, precisely because it is ground launched from a relatively small launcher, whereas the Storm Shadow is, of course, air launched from a highly visible fighter. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the Storm Shadow system. But I think that, as I said, there's a danger both in overstating its effect and understating it. I've said what I think about that. One point which is being made, and it's being made by a lot of people in Russia as well, and I think it is a reasonable and fair point, is this. It's not a question of the capability of this system that ultimately is the issue. It is that once again, the Western powers have supplied a long-range system to Ukraine. In other words, they've escalated. They've escalated by supplying to Ukraine a capability which they had previously said they would not supply to Ukraine. And that enables the Ukrainians to at least attempt deep strikes against Russian positions, including potentially against positions in Russia itself. Now, I've never seen anywhere any statement by a Russian official that has actually publicly said that the deployment or supply of 300-kilometer missiles to Ukraine was for the Russians a red line. Perhaps it was, but I've never actually seen a statement to that effect. Maybe the Russians have said that to the Western powers, to the US especially, in private. I don't know. But it is the case that the Western powers have become increasingly willing to go on supplying weapons of this kind, ever more potent weapons, long-range weapons, to Ukraine, because they are confident that the Russians won't respond. And when I say respond, I mean respond directly against Western assets. Now, perhaps the Russians are wise not to take that step. Maybe the Russian Foreign Ministry has advised the Kremlin that if the Russians engage in a tit-for-tat retaliation, escalation game with the Western powers, then diplomatic support for Russia, which has been very solid across the world, will be jeopardized. And for the Russians, maintaining that diplomatic support is extremely important. Also, it may be that the Russians also calculate that with an extremely unpredictable and dangerous administration in Washington and arguably in London also, engaging in tit-for-tat escalation of this kind might actually threaten a spiral of escalation that could easily get out of control. So you can see the arguments that the Kremlin might be making. But having said that, I am going to say this. I do think some of the people who say that the Russians simply absorbing these blows in the way that they are doing are inviting more blows, more escalation of this kind, especially as other Western weapons prove increasingly less effective. I think that they're making a valid point. And this has been reinforced by an interview that Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, gave to Serbian television. And somewhat, I confess to my astonishment, Peskov again went over the old theme about Russia not wanting an outright war with Ukraine, that the Russians are still proceeding with a special military operation, that they're prepared to go slowly, and that the reason they're prepared to go slowly is because they don't want to inflict excessive numbers of casualties, especially civilian casualties, on the Ukrainian people. They don't want to destroy infrastructure. They don't want to do all those sort of things. Well, that is ethically very commendable. And I have to say, my gut feeling would be very much to go along with it. But I am sure there are many people in Russia who are asking the question, well, if this conflict is as existential for Russia as Vladimir Putin is saying, then why are the Russians conducting the war in this way? Why are they not fighting it properly as a war, given that the other side doesn't seem to operate under the same constraints that the Russians are imposing on themselves? I have to say that Putin's insistence on conducting what is, after all, a war in this very restrained manner, after all that has happened over the last year and a few months, is remarkable. The fact that he has had the authority to control the war in this way and to contain it in this matter is remarkable also. But I can't help but think that if something really ugly happens, which it may do, it might not be possible to keep the lid on this in that kind of way for very much longer. And perhaps if we do find ourselves in a position where the Russians, Putin, decide to take the gloves off, then signaling a lot more clearly to the Western powers what point would have to be reached for that to happen, and perhaps making that fact public might actually be more sensible than simply sitting back and letting the Western powers continuously escalate in the way that they are doing. I have no doubt at all that Putin's restraint is coming in for some criticism in Moscow, and I'm starting to wonder also whether Dmitry Medvedev's various comments, some of which I find wildly over the top, might be implied criticism of Putin, who he refers to, I have noticed, very little indeed in his discussions of the war. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, talking about the diplomatic situation, the overall diplomatic picture, a number of things are coming. Tomorrow, as I've said, there's this critical election in Turkey. I'm not going to say more about that until we know a bit further, until we have more information about it. One thing that is taking place are negotiations about the export of Ukrainian grain. So far, those negotiations, which are intended to discuss the extension of that agreement, whereby the Russians agreed to allow exports of Ukrainian grain from Ukrainian ports in return for the European Union lifting its restrictions on the re-export of grain and fertilizer from Russia to global south countries. Anyway, those negotiations for the moment, still brokered by Turkey, appear to be at a standstill. And the reason is, so far as I can see, that the United States, and I have to say it does look to be the United States, the Pentagon leaks strongly suggested this, that the United States was extremely unhappy by the fact that the European Union in the summer did indicate that it would lift its informal restrictions on the re-export of Russian grain and fertilizer, so that in effect those restrictions have never been lifted. And that really was an alarming event. It's been an alarming event, and it does make one wonder exactly what is going on and whether this deal will be saved. If it's not saved, if export of Ukrainian grain is blocked again, then that will have an effect on world food prices, not so much because there's an enormous amount of Ukrainian grain circulating on world markets. There is quite a lot, but because I think it will be seen as an indicator that the escalation of the war continues and that the underlying problems with the sanctions and all the rest are nowhere in sight of being resolved. And that brings me now to two other countries, because the United States has put an extraordinary amount of pressure on two particular countries. One is Egypt, and the other is South Africa. Now, Egypt has a close relationship with Russia. It imports grain and foodstuffs extensively from Russia. The United States has been trying to get the Egyptians to close their airspace to Russian aircraft. Egypt has been for many years an important destination for Russian tourists. Now, the Egyptian government has defied the United States and has made it clear that it is going to keep its skies open to Russian aircraft. And I think that is an important move, given that Egypt is the biggest Arab country and has been a country that has historically depended heavily on US aid, particularly US military aid. But the other country that has rebelled, if you like, against the United States is arguably even more important, and that is South Africa. Now, South Africa is a member of the BRICS group, but it has also historically had very close relations with the United States. And it is chairing various meetings of the BRICS group soon. And when the ICC, the International Criminal Court, published its indictment of Vladimir Putin, the South African president appeared for a short time to suggest that South Africa was going to pull out of the Rome Statute. As American pressure was exerted, South Africa changed its position. It decided that it would remain within the Rome Statute. It's unclear what the South Africans intend to do about hosting Putin if he is invited to any one of these meetings, BRICS meetings in South Africa. Personally, for security reasons, I don't think he is going to go to this meeting anyway, but we shall see. Anyway, this has already been a point of friction between South Africa and the United States. But the other day, the US ambassador to South Africa made an absolutely extraordinary statement. He claimed that South Africa was secretly supplying weapons to Russia. Now, many countries have been accused around the world of supplying weapons to Russia. Apart from Iran, which has provided Russia with drones and drone technology in return for promises of Su-35 fighter jets. And there are reports, by the way, that Iran is about to receive its first batch of these Sukhoi 35 fighter jets over the next couple of days. But anyway, we'll see whether that's true or not. But anyway, apart from Iran, I don't believe that a single other country has supplied weapons to Russia, apart perhaps from Belarus, whose military-industrial complex anyway is strongly integrated with the Russian. I don't believe that there's been any supply of shells from North Korea. I don't believe that there's been any supply of weapons from China. I think all of these stories are fictions. And I think that this criticism by South Africa, by the US ambassador for allegedly supplying weapons to Russia, is more of that. I mean, the first thing to say is that South Africa uses, as an inheritance, it seems to me, from the previous South African apartheid regime, weapon systems, artillery, that kind of thing, which are not really compatible with Russian systems. And presumably they do have, for example, a stock of 155mm shells, but the Russian military uses 152mm shells. So I can't see the logic of South Africa supplying shells like that, if that's what's been suggested. Anyway, the South Africans have furiously disputed, denied this claim. And in fact, the US ambassador was hauled in. The South Africans are saying that he was forced to apologize for making this obviously untrue claim. But if he did, then I have to say that the United States has not confirmed in public that apology. What we can see, again, is the United States trying to put pressure, this time on an important African country, and getting some pushback. And there's even some talk now, as I understand it, that the South Africans might be considering some kind of diplomatic retaliation against the US Embassy. I doubt that it will come to that myself. But anyway, this shows how much friction there now is between the United States and countries, including South Africa, which, though a member of the BRICS, as I said, has sought to maintain good relations with the United States and to be, to the extent that it can, the US's friend. My own view is that this extraordinary statement from the US ambassador was clearly agreed by Washington itself. It's an indicator of the anger and frustration some people in Washington have about the fact that a country like South Africa continues to defy the United States over the sanctions and such things. This statement was an indicator of US anger boiling over. And what it's done is that it's not intimidated South Africa into falling into line. So far, what it's done is it's provoked pushback. And this is, I'm sorry to say, the increasing style of US diplomacy. It's not a case any longer of talking to the South Africans, trying to understand their perspective, trying to see whether some kind of agreement can be reached, though it's difficult to see what agreement would be reached over this issue. But anyway, trying to agree some sort of modus vivendi with the South Africans, accepting maybe that the South Africans will maintain their contacts with Russia, but that they won't, say, export certain technologies to Russia. You don't do that anymore. The US State Department doesn't do that anymore. Instead, we have American officials trying to bully the South Africans by making publicly comments about South Africa, which they must know are not true. So, that's the style of a US diplomacy today. It is increasingly, by the way, also the style of EU diplomacy today. And it is not succeeding. It is hardening the world against the West. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed two articles that have appeared in the British media, in the Spectator and the Daily Telegraph, about the failure of the sanctions regime and the fact that most of the world is not playing along with the sanctions. And it is unsurprising because people do not like to be bullied. That ought to be a given. And a bully can only get his way if the people he is bullying are not in a position to push back. Once upon a time, not so long ago, that was the case. The United States had put pressure on South Africa. The South Africans, more often than not, would have crumbled. Today, the South Africans have friends they can call on. China, India, Brazil, other big countries, Russia, of course, itself. And they're in a position to say no. And this style of diplomacy, in consequence, not only is no longer working, but it has become even more counterproductive than it was before. Now, I will say this, there's been much discussion about whether or not the US was ever particularly good at diplomacy. On the Duran, we did, Bldngs and I, an interview with US Ambassador Chas Freeman. He was skeptical about the idea that the US ever did diplomacy particularly well. He said that once upon a time, the US did become very skilled in managing its alliance, but he's put it this way. He said that was more empire management than actual diplomacy with peer competitors and other countries. And perhaps he's right. But whatever, I still feel overall that there has been a deterioration, particularly under this administration. And the situation, frankly, if it goes on like this for much longer, it's going to become catastrophic, with the United States finding before long that outside its friends in the West, it has no friends left. Anyway, that's me for the day. We will see what happens in and around Bakhmut. We will see what happens with the Storm Shadow missiles and all those things. And we will see whether this great Ukrainian offensive does materialize over the next few days. That's, as I said, me for the day. Just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Please also remember that you can go to our shop and find yourself the great things that you will see there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.